I'm really, really honored to be joined by three guests. We don't usually have three guests at one time, but our three guests are all editors of a really important new anthology called Daybreak in Gaza, Stories of Palestinian Lives and Culture. And we'll put a link to the chat in, as well as a link to the charity Medical Aid for Palestinians that the proceeds of the book are going to. So let me introduce all three of them. Mahmoud Muna is a writer, publisher, and bookseller from Jerusalem. He runs Jerusalem's celebrated educational bookshop and the bookshop at the American Colony Hotel, both of which I've had the great pleasure of visiting. Mahmoud, great to see you.
Thank you.
And Mahmoud, I was told, in addition to producing this book and running these extraordinary bookstores, is managing to do this Zoom while his three adorable kids are all running around in the background, which is a really extraordinary feat, as any parent of young kids knows. Matthew Teller is a UK-based writer and broadcaster. He's written on the Middle East for the BBC, Guardian, Independent, Financial Times, and has produced documentaries for BBC Radio and World Service. And Juliet Touma is Director of Communications for UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. She has extensive experience in crisis communications and emergency response and has served as head of communications at the UN Development Program in Baghdad, chief spokesman for the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, and regional chief of advocacy and communications for the Middle East and North Africa at UNICEF. So I'm really grateful to all three of you. This conversation is being co-sponsored by my newsletter and by Jewish Currents. People should please, as always, put questions in the chat, and I will be very happy to convey some of them. So Mahmoud, let me start with you. Maybe just tell me a little bit about how this book came to be, how you came to this idea of this really quite remarkable feat of, in the midst of this absolute destruction of Gaza, of reaching out and finding so many Palestinians in Gaza to write about their experiences both over the last year and even before.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Peter. It's a great opportunity to be here with you. Let me start by saying I think I talk for everyone here in this state of mind that we were all in back last year, exactly 12 months ago, kind of a couple of months into this. And we were all trying to reach out for our friends and trying to reach for our loved ones, the few that we knew in Gaza, daily, checking on them, making sure they're okay almost daily. And the conversation we were having with them started to shrink in terms of time and getting shorter and shorter, those little conversations we're having. Questions like, how are you, became a very difficult question to ask and an impossible question to answer. So we were all struggling on how to maintain our relationship in the most humane way in times when things seems to be lacking humanity. And I went back after Christmas, January, to my friends, and I started not to ask them, how are you, but to ask them, tell me more. Tell me more about your life. Tell me more about your family. Tell me about your work, about your neighborhood, about the environment you lived in. For someone like me who lived in Jerusalem for all his life, had no chance to go to Gaza, actually, I wanted to learn also about the Strip itself and the population. And I'm a great believer that people make cities. So if you want to understand a city, you should really understand its people. So that's kind of a desire to also keep in contact with my friends, but also to learn about their lives, kind of instigated for me and for others the need to write this book. I must say something else as well. You know, Peter, the bookshop very well. And in the beginning of the war, I was getting a lot of journalists and a lot of people who were coming to the city. Hopefully at that time, we're in hope to go to Gaza to report eventually from within. But they all were blocked and they were all ended up staying in hotels. And that time, all of them were reporting about Gaza from their hotel rooms. And many of them were actually new to the Middle East. Everyone who stayed 2 nights in a hotel in Dubai became a Middle East expert at that point. And they all were telling me about what happened, what should happen, what's gonna happen, and I was nodding my head and saying, yes, yes, yes. Mostly male, white, middle-class people coming to tell me and lecture me about what's going on in my country. And I was aware that the missing voice was the voice of the Gazans. They're the only one who are blocked and the only one we are not hearing their stories. So, yeah, 2 things came together, my desire to reach out for my friends and my desire to add this layers of humanity, if you like, that was missing in reporting.
Thank you. Matthew's talked a little bit about the idea behind the book. Can you talk a little bit about how you went about actually assembling this very large number of pieces from Gaza when people there are living in just kind of unimaginable conditions? Can you just talk a little bit about the process?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's an incredible testament to the people of Gaza, the people that we spoke to, that they were in the midst of this just appalling, unspeakable, genocidal situation, were able and willing to speak. There was a process where in the first part of this year, as Mahmoud was saying, sort of 12 months ago and slightly less, when we were trying to get the book off the ground and looking for publishers, and we found a publisher in the end, a small publisher in London, an independent publisher called Saki, who have a long track record in fiction and non-fiction from the Middle East. So once we had the green light to go ahead, it was a process of activating the networks that all four of us, the four editors of this book, and also the publishers have. So Mahmoud obviously has a huge network based in the bookshop in Jerusalem. Juliet has her network through UNRWA. She's based in Amman, but she goes to and from Gaza all the time. Our fourth editor, Jayab Abu Safia, is a journalist born and brought up in Jabalia in Gaza, who now lives and works in London. And I'm based in the UK as well. So it was and I have a long connection with Palestine and working in and around the Middle East. So it was a case of activating our networks as best we could, as sensitively as we could as well, trying to stay aware throughout that there is a process that's familiar to people in the region and elsewhere of exploitation, where journalists will come in and take a story and leave and never be seen or heard of again. And it was very important to us, obviously, not to do that and to try and get across the idea that this is a project of value, that we are also trustworthy as well. And many, many people did put their trust in us, which now is a responsibility. There's a burden there that we feel in carrying these stories forward. I was interviewing people face to face in London and over Zoom in different cities in the US and in France and in cities in Europe as well, and also in the Middle East. Jayab was in Cairo, also interviewing people face to face and also on the phone as well. The same with Juliet, Mahmoud too. Mahmoud was meeting and interviewing people in Jerusalem, but also contacting people through, initially through phone and through WhatsApp. That became increasingly difficult during the spring when the bombardment got worse and conditions deteriorated and people were being displaced en masse and connections were often dropping. And we very often found that we were contacting people sometimes by text, sending questions or making contact by text and then sending questions. And then people would choose to reply by voice note. Often we would wake up in the morning and there'll be voice notes overnight, because that was when connections were most stable and when people were able to respond. Mahmoud tells this story. I'm sure Mahmoud can tell it better than I can as well, about an interview that he was doing with a particular person when the connection fell. Mahmoud, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I was interviewing in the afternoon and the line was bad and I was not hearing each other. And then he said, look, call me at midnight and I will move somewhere where there's internet and when we can have a longer conversation. And instantly I was like, yeah, of course, that's great. I'll call you at midnight. Only a second later, it occurred to me that someone is actually traveling at midnight, which is the peak and the most risky of time in Gaza at the time, in the dark somewhere just to have an internet so he can talk to me. And that sense of responsibility, I think, was harnessed in a way in that moment, really, and the feeling of trust that people are putting into us.
So it was a process of gathering voices as best we could. There were also pieces that are previously published as well. There's a poem by Mahmoud Darwish we included. There's a short story by Ghassan Kanafani. We found the rights to be able to reproduce that. Very, very proud indeed to be able to bring that amazing story to a wider audience. That was written when he was very young, when he was about 19. In 1956, he wrote a story called Letter from Gaza. Enormously powerful, incredible piece of writing from Kanafani. So that's included as well. There's a multitude of different voices that we tried to reach, specifically moving beyond the circle of writers and artists and poets who are often represented and who often are able to reach a Western audience much better than the people we try to reach as well. Shopkeepers, cafe owners, students, teachers, athletes, I don't know, all sorts of different people from different walks of life.
Right. Thank you. Let me go to you, Juliet. You can hear me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us, Peter.
Okay, there may be a little bit of a delay, but what do you think are some of the stereotypes that people outside of Gaza have about people in Gaza that this book challenges? Again, even people who might think of themselves as sympathetic to Palestinians in Gaza and upset about what's happening to them can sometimes reduce the people living in Gaza into kind of very caricatured or flat stereotypes. And I'm wondering, Julia, if you could just talk a little bit about some of the things that come through about Palestinians in Gaza that people outside might not think about.
Yeah, Peter, I think one of the reasons why I have the honor to join this project is precisely because of the dehumanization that happened very early on.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.